You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Wednesday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're joining me on the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1. There, my voice just cracked like a pubescent teenage male. I assure you, I am well out of puberty. But that's over at ODYSY1.com, where you can see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And find all the different outlets where you can listen to this show. I also simulcast this show on my YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over right now, join the Intrepid family, and they're over there, the family of listeners and friends of this program. They're over there chatting up a storm already. So come on and join us. That's probably one of the best features of the YouTube channel. And by the way, if you are not subscribed to my YouTube channel, go ahead and do that. You can find every single episode that I have ever done on Odyssey Radio down below in all of my archives on my YouTube channel main page. There's nearly 200 of them. And so you'll have a lot of good listening pleasure. And there's stuff in there from before I was doing Odyssey. So there's plenty to look at, plenty to listen to, plenty of enjoying radio time. So that's at least 200 hours of listening over there. So go enjoy yourself. So welcome to tonight's show. Here we are on a Wednesday in the middle of the week, as it's up here in the Great White North, Minnesota to Wisconsin. It's starting to warm up. I think we're even going to be hitting an 80-degree temperature over the next couple of days, so the weather forecast says. I'm all for that. I've been getting out and standing in the sun. I'm not doing much work out in the yard yet, but I'll go outside and I'll just bask in the sun for a little bit over the few days. So I'm starting to work on my tan. Hopefully by the time summer comes, I'll look a lot less Welsh and Scandinavian. Oh, by the way, I just had my DNA redone. Now, it's from old data. About 5 or 6 years ago, Rainey and I did the DNA tests with Ancestry.com. And mine came back and said I was predominantly Welsh and British. Just a tiny, tiny bit of Scots in there, even though we had Scots family names in our family tree. And so I've taken on the mantle of being quite Welsh. But the DNA also said I had about 16% Scandinavian blood in me, Norwegian, Swedish, and all of that. And so the way I figured, rather tongue-in-cheek, was that, you know, being living in Great Britain, my ancestors, and the Welsh, that probably somewhere along the way we were raided by the Vikings, and so we've got that infusion of Scandinavian blood. Probably a little bit of that, and I think that there's a few Scandinavian names way back in the mix on my mom's side, and way back wives that married in and things like that on the family tree. And so my wife submitted it to a different service that she uses, myheritage.com. And we could port all my DNA data from Ancestry over there, which we did, and that came back and said I was predominantly Norwegian. It said that my bloodline was 53% Norwegian, and that my Welsh and British was the lesser percent of like under 20%, or just the low 20s. And I thought, how can they get such vastly different DNA results from the same sample? Because Ancestry places me at what we always thought by the family names and the family tree that were predominantly Welsh. and British. And you can trace my family tree. I've traced it back to the 1520s in Nottingham in England, and then they went into Wales, and so, it's there. And so, but finding that Scandinavian, that Norwegian connection, now they say I'm 53% Norwegian. I have my doubts about that because of my family name. But at least I can say with some level of surety, there's some Viking blood in me. So, on top of my Welsh ancestry. So there you go. I thought that was a very interesting find. I love history, and I love personal history. And I hope that shows in some of the shows that we're doing here. Now, we've been speaking of that. We've been talking about Solomon. We've been talking about the temple in Jerusalem. And the reason, maybe this is, and I've said this before in this little mini-series, maybe it's no big shakes to you what happened in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or frankly last week. And so maybe this is not relevant to you. To me, having grown up I went to Bible college, I went to seminary, and I studied all of this stuff. The history of Israel was pretty top on my list as it pertained to biblical history. And so it was always a lot of fun for me to explore this stuff and to look at the archaeology. One of my best favorite teachers in seminary, and he's become a friend of mine in life, is Dr. Charles Ayling. When I was 11 years old and in Sunday school, I was given an assignment. All the guys in our Sunday school class got an assignment. Write a sentence or two on this topic. And it was one of the seminary students from the seminary housed in the same big church facility I went to, Monster Church, Big Fortress Church. And they taught the Sunday school classes, and so he gave me the question, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And by my books and my work on, that guy over my shoulder, Senenmut, The Exodus Reality, the book that John Ward and I wrote together, all of these things came from a source point. And it was when he gave me that topic, it lit me on fire at 11 years old. And he said, I recommend you go talk to a guy named Chucky Ayling. Chucky was the name. Now, this is back in 1972, was when I was 11 years old. And so I made a phone call to Chucky Ayling, and I was a kid, an 11-year-old kid, and I connected with him and said, I'm doing a report for Sunday school. I was told you might have some information you can give me. And so we lined up to meet after the church service on the next Sunday. And so we met, and when I walked up, I recognized who he was. I had seen him around the church, and he was a short, he was not a fat man. I don't want to put it that way. If you're listening, Dr. Ayling, I don't mean any offense by this, but he was a short kind of, egg-headed looking professor. Think of that. Balding on top, horn-rimmed glasses, and he had a voice like, he'd say, oh, my, he'd say about things. Yes, this is exciting stuff. And so I sat down with him after the church service for about 15, 20 minutes, and he gave me some information. And that was the information that is still the basic information that is the foundation for my theory in my book. He told me that he believed Amenhotep II was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, he didn't bring up Senenmut. That's a totally different. That's something I've built on top of that. But Senenmut fits into that timeline. And so that's where I started getting my love for this stuff. My love of archaeology started when I was 11 years old. My love of history, even though I hated it in school, it's because we had a shitty professor. I got to tell you, to be frankly blunt, not even a professor. He was the math teacher at this small Christian school that also took on the mantle of teaching history. So, and he was not exciting. Mr. McLean, God love you. I've bumped into him a few times in my adult life. He's a decent guy. But the way he taught history, he would stand in the front of the class, and he'd have a book like this, the history book, our textbook, open, and he'd be holding it like this. and he had one knee, a foot up on a chair and his elbow on his knee, and he would read the book. He would be like, and then the British attacked York in 1782. And he'd pause and wait for us to take notes, and then he'd just keep reading, and it was boring as utter shit. And so I hated history when I was in school. My true love of history really began when I got out of college and into seminary, and I really started digging into biblical history for my classes. It became alive. It became exciting. It became a way to take the stories of things that I said I believed by faith and look at the historical facts around them and see a much broader picture. And so that's what I do now. Now, by the way, I had somebody who said something on one of my posts for one of these shows that we're doing on Solomon, expressing that they believe that maybe Solomon didn't even exist at all. And my response, a quick response, was, well, there are too many ancient historians, first century and before, that talk about Solomon's temple. This person was talking about Solomon's temple not existing. And so I went and I tried to look some things up, and I found an interesting article. Before we dig into this too deeply, this is a Nat Geo, National Geographic article. Now, it's a little older. It's 10 years old, but it mentions somebody that I've mentioned on this show before, Dr. Eilat Matzar. And this article was where she was posting information and publishing the information about having come across King Solomon's wall. And at least she's dating it to the period that King Solomon would have lived. Now, Eilat Matzar is here. I'm gonna call her up so I can do justice to her credentials. Eilat Matzar is she served at the as well. Let's see. She's just a couple of years older than I am. She's an Israeli archaeologist. She specializes in Jerusalem Phoenician archaeology, and she got her PhD from the Hebrew University in '97. And she's the granddaughter of pioneering Israeli archaeologist Benjamin Matzar. And Matzar served as a senior fellow at the Shalem Center. She worked on the Temple Mount excavations and other places. I'm not going to get into all of her stuff. And what interested me was her excavations at the Temple Mount. And I mentioned to you that I had Eilat Matzar on this show, the Intrepid radio program, back when John Ward and I were doing it together a few years ago. And this would date back to about 2014, I think was the date that we had her on. It was December, I seem to remember, 2014. We had Eilat Matzar live from Israel. And so we did our show at 9 p.m., or was it 10 p.m. on Sunday evenings. And so we got her live in Israel, which would have been about 6 a.m. her time. She got up and took our call to do this radio show, and we talked about her archaeological discoveries in Israel. And what a cool show. And at the time, she had been just written up in several publications about having discovered what she believed was the Citadel of David. And in the northern portion of the city of David, which we've talked about the last few days. And so I thought it was very cool, and the work that she'd done. I was very intrigued by it. And I found this article in response to somebody who came in and asked, didn't really ask. They kind of stated, I don't think Solomon's temple ever really existed. And I'm not criticizing that, because that's a very common response to this from a secular point of view, from a non-researched point of view. And this is I want to show you a picture here. This is a wall that she discovered, Eilat Matzar. Now, this is about 10 years ago. Now, I want you to look at this. This is that southern wall of what is called the traditional temple compound. That's up at the top of the picture. And you see this isn't the Dome of the Rock there, but it's the mosque that you see that's next to the Dome of the Rock on the temple compound. that you see up in the upper left-hand portion of the picture. And you see it sticking up over the wall. But down below, about midway through the picture, you see this wall, and you see down below that, toward the bottom of the picture, the gatehouse. And so this is a 3,000-year-old structure that's been uncovered. It was buried in rubble. And this is a 3,000-year-old defensive wall that was possibly built by King Solomon. And it was unearthed in Jerusalem about 10 years ago. And that's according to Eilert Matzar. And the 10th century BC wall is 230 feet long and about 6 meters or 20 feet high. And it stands along what was then the edge of Jerusalem, between the Temple Mount, still Jerusalem's paramount landmark today, and the ancient city of David, today a modern-day Arab neighborhood called Silwan. And now the stone barrier is part of this defensive complex that includes a gatehouse, an adjacent building, a guard tower, which has been only partially excavated, and according to Eilert Matzar, who led the dig for the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Now, over the years, these structures were partially demolished. This is over the centuries. Their building materials were scavenged for other structures, and what remained was buried under rubble. And so the Bible's first book of Kings, widely believed to have been written centuries after the time period in question, says that Solomon, the king of Israel, built this or a defensive wall in Jerusalem. And the new discovery is the first archaeological evidence of this structure. Now, how do you know that this has anything to do with the biblical passage? Let me read the passage. 1 Kings 3:1 says, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. So that's the reference in 1 Kings. And so the question comes up about this particular, here I closed my notes, hang on a second, there it is, Solomon's Wall, and the question comes up as to how can you date this to that era. Here, I'm going to turn off the picture here, but take a last look at that. That's the wall and the gatehouse and some of the adjacent buildings that she found underneath the rubble, dating back 3,000 years. Now, how do you date a structure to the time of Solomon? Now, ancient artifacts were found in and around the complex, and they pointed to 10th century BCE. And we don't have many kings during the 10th century that could have built such a structure. Basically just David and Solomon, said Matzar. And according to the Bible, King David was the father of King Solomon, who was said to have built the first temple of Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Now, this doesn't give any proof that Solomon built the temple. It's just establishing data around that. And ceramics found near the wall helped narrow the date down, being of a level of sophistication that was common to the second half of the 10th century BCE, King Solomon's time. Now, I want to show you another picture here, folks. And if you're listening on radio, I'm just showing some pictures of some pottery shards. Now, when I was in Egypt several times, everywhere you walk, you're kicking up stuff like this on the ground. And I go to Silsila, Gebel El Silsila, my friends John Ward and Maria Nilsson, their archaeological site on the Nile down south of Luxor. You walk around that, all over that site, and that site is huge, by the way. It's about 23 miles square, spanning both sides of the Nile. Old quarry site, and the environs around it. But you're kicking up pottery like this all the time. This photograph I'm showing you in what this guy's holding in his hand is just shards of pottery and bits and bobs. And you'd look at that and go, "What is? How can you date anything by that?" Well, the style of pottery, the sophistication of the technology used in the pottery. You can see where it's cracked on the edges. You can see how it was baked. You can see the materials used. You can see in the ridges that you see in the clay how it was put together, and that pretty, and sometimes by some of the decoration that appears. You can date this stuff by that. And the pottery and the artifacts that were being found by Matsar along this wall dated to roughly the 10th century BCE, mid-900s, which is when Solomon reigned. Now, there's a 3-foot tall earthenware storage vessels that were found near the gatehouse. One of them with a Hebrew inscription indicating the container belonged to a high-ranking government official. So, figurines typical of the 10th century BCE Jerusalem, including 4-legged animals, large-breasted women likely symbolizing fertility, were also uncovered at this gatehouse, as were jar handles bearing impressions reading "to the king" and various Hebrew names, she said. And the artifacts may hint at the area's street life in biblical times. Here the ancient Jerusalemites, however that's said, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, would have gathered around the wall's city gate to trade, to settle disputes via street-side judges, engage in ritual practices, and stock up on water and supplies for treks outside the city. So this is what pottery does for you. And I want to give you another shot again of that temple wall. This is, and you see the paths down at the bottom center, kind of, where you're walking between the buildings. This is the gatehouse and some of the buildings that are connected to all of this. So that's pretty cool. You're looking at the ancient city gates and the ancient northern wall of the city of David, which in this picture runs right up to the temple compound. If you remember, let me find you a picture of this. Once again, this city of David that we've shown a couple of times. This picture right here, you see right in the center of the picture, you've got a wall there, and that's north of David's palace. Well, this isn't probably the best picture to show this. Let me show maybe this one. Here you go. Where you see the temple in the center with the big white arrow and the round red circle. That would have been the northern environs of the city of David. But you look up north there and you'll see the southern wall of the temple compound. And what they have found, and you can barely see it. Right in there you see the dark dome. It's in between the arrow for the temple and the arrow for the western wall. Right smack in the center of the picture. See that dark dome on the Temple Mount? That's one of the mosques that you see in that other picture. So all this rubble of this wall, if you look and you see the lighter colored sun-exposed southern wall of the temple compound, and you look below that, you see all that rubble in there. Those are the rubble. That's the excavations taking place of the rubble of that 3,000-year-old northern wall that Solomon built. You see, the city of David, when David was in it, went as far as that red circle. Well, Solomon expanded that out during his time. And so that's what you're looking at. And so how reliable is the Bible when it comes to dating these things? The Tel Aviv University archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, who was not involved in this particular excavation, agrees that it's possible that King Solomon constructed the wall. But Finkelstein cautions, and many biblical scholars, archaeological historians, they will tell you and they'll caution you against leaning too heavily on the Bible to interpret the findings. Familiarity with religious or historic texts connected to any given site is important, Finkelstein said, but their usefulness can vary. It depends on the text. Each has its own characteristic. Each needs to be approached differently. There's a question as to when it was written 300 years after or at the time of the events. What are its goals and its ideology, and why was it written? So those are all the things you have to look for in biblical archaeology. And for her part, Eilert Matzar believes it's natural for archaeologists excavating in the Holy Land to consult with biblical texts along with other ancient documents. I don't believe, she said, there is an archaeologist who wouldn't excavate a site upon which texts have been written about without being familiar with those texts. So you have to familiarize yourself with the biblical texts. And folks, we're right up against it for this first half. We're going to come back after this break and hit some more of this. So sit tight, stay tuned. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over and watch the simulcast with the live chat room going on right now during this broadcast at my YouTube page, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. All right, talking about the Temple of Solomon. We're talking about dating things. We're talking about archaeology. And we left off kind of talking about Eilert Motzar and her discoveries of the wall, and so much more has been done on that in the last 10 years. That's an article that we read from National Geographic, that was written 10 years ago about her discoveries, and she's done so much more since then. But there's a couple of other little points about archaeology that I want to show you. Now, I am not an archaeologist. I did not go to school for archaeology, but I know plenty about archaeology. I know plenty about history. I have dear friends who are archaeologists that have exposed me even more on a first-hand level, and so a hands-on level. And I wanted to show you one more picture from Eilert Motzar's excavations, and it's this. It's the Sifting. Take a look at this picture real close. You see these screens built into these wooden boxes. And you see the rubble inside there. This is the sifting that takes place when you are on an archaeological dig. When you're digging back 3,000 years and you put a shovel full of dirt from the site where you're excavating and you run it through this screen, you shake out all the sand, all the loose dirt, and what's left you've got to sift through. And you're looking for artifacts. Perhaps there was a bit of pottery that was smashed and crumbled into bits, and you're finding these. And so sometimes the level of archaeology, of finds of artifacts, is astounding on this level of almost micro researching the rubble that you have. Now imagine a site that is, 10 acres big. And you're digging through and you're going shovel by shovel, sifting through like this. That's why you have crews, archaeological teams. Some people will do this, some will lift the shovels, some will dig, and so on. So that's one picture. Now I want you to see this one as well. This is a picture when I was at Silsila the last time, a couple of years ago. And they were on one side of the Nile, on the east side of the Nile. Remember, their whole site is the old quarry sites, the ancient quarry sites in Egypt. This is where they quarried sandstone, moved it up the river to Luxor, moved it up the river even farther north. And they would find inscriptions and all kinds of things all over the walls. Well, there was one, and there were spoil heaps, by the way. When they would chip away all this stuff, they would carry it away in big muktas, baskets, and they would dump the rubble over the hill. And so you have these huge hills of rubble. Well, as they were digging, they found at Silsila the old stables of Tiberius, they've labeled it, Tiberius Caesar. So we're talking, right around, the just around the time of what? 30 to 0 BCE, right in that time period. And I can't say lots about this. I don't know what all is published about it. I know they've talked about the stables, so it's not mine. It's not my proprietary information to share anything. But I'm going to show you this picture. I took this from across the river. You see the Nile River down at the bottom. And I'm on the west bank. And I'm looking back, and they were all working over on the east bank. Now you can see some of the quarries, the big walls you see behind there. These are some of the quarries that are closer to the river. If you go up over those hills there, on the other side, there are huge, massive quarries that they've been excavating and sorting out inscriptions and so on. But in this particular picture, you can see the spoil heaps up on top. All those hills up there, that's centuries of spoil from chipping away the stone and dumping everything out. And now you can see the same in the middle of the picture. But what is being covered up there is where you see all the people standing there. I'm going to try something here. I'm going to try to bring this picture a little bigger. Hang on here. See if I can actually get to it. Oh, there it is. Okay. So if I blow this picture up a little bit, here you go. You're seeing this happen. Sorry, those on radio, you're not seeing any of this. Now, there's the big spoil heap. And you see up at the top here, way up at the top left, are actually John and Maria. And her back is to me, and John's facing me, but he's talking to her. They don't know I'm over on the West Bank taking their picture with a telephoto lens. And they're standing in the offices. There was a building structure that was there, and they cleared out the foundation on the top. And I was up there with them clearing some of that out and sifting, going through things. You can see all the workers up on top there, the archaeologists that are digging on different portions of the wall of this building. And the other side, the opposite side of this is where all the stables were. And you see people sifting there. You see the person way over on the far right. Looks like a slight dusty cloud around them. It's because they're sifting. And they're also dumping rock over the edge, just like they did in ancient times. So this is that site, but this is where we were digging. We're going through all this rubble. And I want you to see this particular picture right here. When I talk about, remember I was showing you this picture right here of sifting with a screen in a box and going through all this small stuff? Well, look at this. At this site, John showed me this. You see that little bead on his fingertip? Can you believe that he found that in this? In all this rubble, and he turns up a bead that's more than 2,000 years old. And so that is the amazing work, the microscopic work that gets done with archaeologists when they're digging on these sites. So there you go. I wanted to show you that stuff. I thought that would be very interesting as we proceed along here in talking about archaeology. Now, there's also something else here that I want you to know. There were artifacts that were found, the first artifacts that they found on the Temple Mount. Back in, this is an article from 2016. So about 4 years ago, but archaeologists spotlighted the first Solomonic Temple era artifacts ever found on the Temple Mount itself. Now remember, we've been talking the last few days. Is it possible that the Temple of Solomon was located a little bit further to the south, and that the whole temple compound as we know it today, where the Dome of the Rock sits, that this was just the Roman fortress. And so, and part of the problem is archaeologists have never had the opportunity to excavate beneath the Temple Mount. And this was carried out in a very rare cooperation with Muslim authorities. There were a series of digs in the last few years at a flashpoint site that yielded unprecedented proof of biblical time activity on the site of what is now known as the Temple Mount, which would contradict all the theories that say maybe it was located on a different site, a little bit south. Now, Israeli archaeologists presented new details of what they said were the first tiny artifacts that were unearthed in situ, meaning in their place, on the Temple Mount, and ever conclusively dated to the time of the first temple, over 2,600 years ago. And the discoveries were made during limited scientific excavations carried out atop the Flashpoint Temple Mount in the past decade, and the first of their kind since the British Mandate. This is prior to Israel becoming a nation. So it's been over 70 years since there had been any kind of excavation work done on the Temple Mount. And the highly sensitive Israeli excavations were conducted with minimum publicity in cooperation with the Islamic Waqf, which manages the incendiary holy site. And the artifacts excavated from the mount, detailed in a paper, and presentations at a conference at the Hebrew University are said to include, get this, olive pits, 2,600-year-old olive pits, animal bones, pottery fragments, dating to the time of the first temple between the 8th and the 6th centuries BCE. Archaeologists have previously found a limited number of artifacts from First Temple period Jerusalem, but none of those finds were uncovered atop the mount itself. Rather, they were uncovered from the Ophel excavation. Remember Mount Ophel? That's just to the south of the southern wall of what is today called the Temple Mount, down toward the city of David. And and so they were recovered from that area. And from the Temple Mount Sifting project, which examines rubble credibly believed to have been removed from the holy site and dumped in the nearby Kidron Valley long time ago. And so it's the first time that they've found artifacts from this period in situ on the Temple Mount. Yuval Baruch, the head of the Israel Antiquities Authority Jerusalem region, said Thursday of the discoveries, as far as the biblical period is concerned, the Temple Mount is a tabula rasa. Nobody knows anything, says Baruch, who headed the archaeological work. It's still very limited, he said, but the tiny fragments of clay and bone are at least something. It exists, he says. And so the digs at the mount were carried out between 2007 and 2016, after the Waqf requested authorization from Israel to perform maintenance work on infrastructure servicing the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, the main structures situated atop the Temple Mount. Now, I got to say something. There has always been this resistance by Islam, by Muslims, to uncover anything on the Temple Mount for fear that it will politically create a problem. But I think that you will find that there are many scientists, archaeologists within Islam, within Christianity, within Judaism, who say, I don't care what my religion says. We want to know things. We want to know fact. And I worked with archaeologists over at Gebel El Silsila that I asked them about being Muslim. And this was during the last time I was there, during just the height of ISIS. And they would say, we have nothing to do with that. We're scientists. We want to know things. Same thing in Jerusalem. And I think that there are Muslims that wanted this cooperation because it doesn't matter to them if the Muslim site now was once an ancient Israeli site of the temple. Doesn't matter. They want to know. Nobody's going to come and bulldoze the Dome of the Rock. So, anyway, let's move on from that. That's the politics of it. And I think the politics are with the politicians, not with the scientists and the artists and so on. And so they were performing all this maintenance work, and the construction of the Marwani Mosque in the late 1990s didn't involve cooperation with archaeologists and resulted in the destruction of antiquities and severe tensions between Israel and the Islamic authorities. When they built the mosque there, on that site in the 1990s, they destroyed ancient artifacts. They destroyed ancient structures beneath. It's because they didn't care. And so the IAA made limited announcements in the past about its activities on the Mount, and they released brief details of the first temple finds. But Thursday's conference marked the most, and this is back in 2016, marked the most detailed presentation of the near decade of work, the finds, and their significance. Now, there's been excavation of a trench for electric cables in 2007 that allowed archaeologists the first opportunity to delve below the surface of the contested holy site, since Israel captured it in the 1967 Six-Day War. All work was conducted with police escort due to the sensitivity of the site. And although the Waqf received permission from the Israel police and the electric cooperation to lay the power cable, some archaeologists at the time criticized the operation, saying it wasn't conducted with professional and careful archaeological supervision, involving meticulous documentation. When you are digging into old areas of old cities, even here in New York City, remember when they discovered the big slave cemetery in downtown Manhattan? I think it was Manhattan or Long Island. It was one of those. And it was beneath when they were demolishing a building and building something new. They found an old cemetery. You have to stop work and let the archaeologists in. This is important information. And so presenting the finds after their examination marked an opportunity for the IAA to rebuff critics who claim the Temple Mount is a scene of archaeological bedlam. While the Temple Mount Sifting project has rummaged through the fill from the holy site excavated during the construction of the Marwani Mosque in the 90s, these newly described digs were the first archaeological study atop the Temple Mount since the 1930s. And the finds on the Temple Mount itself range from a previously undocumented monumental structure believed to be from the 11th and the 12th centuries BCE. Oh, no, this would be AD, where the Dome of the Rock sits. In the period preceding and including the Crusades, to artifacts from Roman times, and unprecedentedly in situ finds from as far back as the First Temple period, which would place it in the late 900s BCE. Now, it's not an excavation that you go to a place and you dig, Baruch said of the work on the Mount. It's more inspection, and in that framework, finds are discovered. And so among the most significant of those finds dug up during the laying of the power cable approximately 400 feet southeast of the Dome of the Rock was a jumble of remains dating to the First Temple period. And that's what they're calling, whether you believe the temple existed or not, it's called the First Temple period. This is the time in the late 900s BCE or the late 10th century BCE. And so this layer included pottery fragments characterized in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, as well as animal bones and charred olive pits. Baruch, Ronnie Reich, and Deborah Sandhaus, authors of the accompanying paper on the discoveries, wrote this. Carbon-14 dating of the olives yielded dates from around the 6th to the 8th centuries BCE, and this date is confirmed by the dates of the pottery. Another segment of the same trench turned up a Roman coin dating to 383 AD, and iron arrowheads, which the author said could be rare evidence of activity in the Roman period in the courtyard between the raised part of the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, additional findings from the work carried out on the Temple Mount by the IAA have yet to be published, Baruch said, including conservation work conducted in Solomon's stables, a subterranean vault beneath the Temple Mount's platform in the past year. And the publication points to the fact that despite all statements and such, we're on the Temple Mount and working, overseeing, and business is done under the authority of the IAA. And Baruch told the Times of Israel on the sidelines of the conference. So, somebody said, by the way, in the comments on this article, used to hearing only negatives. It's so wonderful to hear of cooperation on the Temple Mount archaeology. I despair of hostility to uncovering what is a rich history to us all. I've read Muslims may fear evidence of a temple, but archaeology is fascinating and precious. I'd love to visit the newly excavated tunnels. What an incredible holy place Jerusalem is. And, you get people making negative comments and so on, but this is what's going on in Israel now. These are the more recent. This is in the last 4 years. These discoveries were made, and there's so much more that's going on. So while they cannot go in and break ground and shovel down within the Temple Mount compound, this is certainly a place where they're able to do little bits of archaeology around the Temple Mount, from old excavations and from renovation work and stuff where they've dumped the rubble over the edge and it falls outside of the Islamic turf, if you will. And they've been able to sift through that and find excavation and find things. And so this is really interesting stuff. And when you start dating, now to me it's really interesting stuff. And when you start trying to date this stuff and you start asking that big question, did another site exist for the temple? Was there another location for it? We're used to seeing these headlines about bloody clashes between Arabs and Israelites over the Temple Mount. But another battle that involves old arguments is re-emerging, being waged over the history and the archaeology as it relates to where Jerusalem's temple actually existed. And what are the facts? And in recent years, we've seen denials that any Jewish temples ever existed in Jerusalem around the Temple Mount. There are people like the person I had today on one of my posts for this show said something about they didn't believe the Temple of Solomon ever existed. Well, that's been a raging debate for centuries. And did it even exist in Jerusalem? I don't think there's any question. The Israelites occupied the land. Jerusalem was their capital city. Yeah, they had a temple there. And now the other theory is making the rounds, that's following from similar ideas that are put forward decades ago, that are proposing that Jerusalem temples never existed on top of the Temple Mount, but instead were located several hundred yards to the south over the Gihon Spring. This is what we've been talking about the last couple of days. The original water source for ancient Jerusalem was the Gihon. And according to this theory, the area that's been identified as the Temple Mount for the last 2,000 years is actually the site of the Antonia Fortress, originally built by Herod the Great and later used by the Romans. This is the theory, and I showed you a picture of that in the model of the site yesterday, where you see the fortress there. Now they're saying the current theories that place the temple further south, over the Gihon. They're saying that this temple compound that exists today beneath the Dome of the Rock is actually the ruins, the platform for the Roman fort. Now this theory isn't supported by any trained Western archaeologists today. It's built on a number of flawed assumptions, and it's contradicted by a great deal of biblical, historical, and archaeological evidence. Regrettably, since it ignores or denies clear evidence, it also plays into the hands of those who deny any Jewish presence or any Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And so in understanding the history of Jerusalem, we have to be aware of the limitations of archaeological evidence. One is simply the fact that Jerusalem is a thriving, growing, active city, modern housing, modern businesses, modern buildings, streets and schools all lie atop whatever ruins exist from the ancient times. And this makes it extraordinarily difficult to excavate in and around ancient Jerusalem. Now, the situation isn't helped by the fact that the city's been fought over dozens of times and destroyed and rebuilt several more times over the centuries. Nor does it help that the temple constructed by King Solomon was destroyed by Babylonian invaders around 587 BCE, and the ruins were covered and built over by a massive foundation platform atop which was built a later temple by Herod. And then destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So just think for a second. When you think of that platform, that walled platform where the Dome of the Rock sits, if you could actually dig down beneath that and into the rubble beneath that, which nobody's allowed to do, they excavate all the way up to the perimeters of the walls of that compound, but they can't dig into the compound. Imagine if you could go down and what you might find there. Because Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in the early 5th, 6th century BCE. So when that was rebuilt by Zerubbabel after they returned from Babylon, they cleared down the rubble, they paved it over, built a new temple. And then Herod expanded that temple. So what's beneath? What's down underneath? What could you possibly find beneath that? It's like, let me reference Gebel El Silsila again, John and Maria's site. They discovered an old temple there on that site. And what was interesting was there were at least 3 stratas of temple. They found a temple that was built in Roman times. But then, and that was destroyed. You go down underneath, they find a chamber and they find walls and they find artifacts from a temple built during the 18th dynasty and the time of Amenhotep IV. You go down beneath that and you find ruins of a temple attributed to this guy, to Senenmut and Hatshepsut. And so those 3 layers of temple exist already. And so what do you suppose would be under the Temple Mount if we were allowed to excavate there? I think it would be fantastic knowledge would be unearthed. Doesn't matter about religion and politics. What matters is, what does history have to tell us down below? And so, like Solomon's temple, the temple of Jesus' day was so thoroughly destroyed in the Roman conquest of Jerusalem in 70 AD that, as Jesus foretold in Matthew 24:2, some say this is his prophecy, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Is that a prophecy or was that added later? We don't know. He was, in context, as shown by those verses, clearly talking about the temple itself and its outer buildings and its structures, not the foundation platform on which they built, a fact misunderstood by many over the years. And when it comes to the scarcity of archaeological remains, it was also common up until very recent times to recycle building stones in new structures, making it very difficult, if not impossible, to locate more than a fraction of the original pieces of the ancient buildings. We go over into Egypt and you find old mud brick structures that date back 3,000 years, but then you find them in houses that were built in 1920. Some of the brick they would take and they would recycle it even as recently as the last century. So it has happened over the centuries, and so there's been a degradation of what does exist there. And folks, we're at the end of the time. We're going to pick this up tomorrow, talking about more of the archaeology, setting a case for the temple compound that exists today beneath the Dome of the Rock as being the actual historical site of Solomon's temple and Herod's temple to follow. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this stuff. I love it. We'll be back tomorrow. 23-hour break. Sit tight.